So first of all, I want to say thank you guys. I think this is a great session. I didn't realize that I'm the last one of the day, and definitely between you and getting onto your personal lives and doing those things. So thank you for staying on. I'm really hoping that we can get some good conversations and then ultimately some really great questions. I love the last session and specifically what Bernard was bringing to the table and some of the questions that came up specifically around, how do you get that top leadership and management engaged in these conversations? And to Frank's point, I've had over 20 years of experience getting to work on enterprise risk management with a very heavy focus on IT and cyber. And I think the most important aspect of that is realizing that this is not the only risk that our executive leaders are having to focus on. And so being able to understand that as we're going in and having those conversations with the board members or executive leaders in the organization, it really comes down exactly as Bernard had mentioned about understanding the business, understanding what's important to them, understanding what their risk tolerances are, and then also just having the healthy conversations around where things really need to go and how you mitigate those risks and work through those avenues. So I did create a few slides on this and figured we'd kind of get started on this. Just in general, I think we all know there's a few different areas that you can focus on from a risk management perspective. And, obviously we're not going to avoid every risk. But I think understanding that organizations can make decisions, and as us as CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, we get asked to come to the table and explain what those risk factors are, and then ultimately help in making those decisions. It may be as simple as saying, hey, I'm not going to get into this business, so therefore I'm really not concerned about NIST 800-171. Or it may be a matter of, hey, I've made the decision I'm not going to go into New York and start working in that aspect, so I don't have to worry about those regulatory requirements. Those are options, and we can absolutely have those right types of conversations. I think our management teams are definitely looking more to how do we make sure that we're focusing our energy and providing them with those abilities of understanding those risk portfolios and helping to get a better validity on what we should be going through from a standpoint of saying, hey, I do want to avoid this, I want to reduce the risk, I want to transfer, or I want to accept it. As CISOs, we spend a lot of time focusing on how we can reduce that risk and how we can make sure we've got the right security controls in place. And I think in some cases we also forget that sometimes it's not a matter that they want to spend all those dollars to reduce those risks, and they ask us and challenge us to be a little different in those aspects, to think differently as to how we can really provide the best type of services for the organization, reduce the risk factor associated with it, and make them aware of it. In my practices previously, I would always take that opportunity to write up a risk document, make sure that my counterpart in my IT organization or security organization for that matter, as well as the business owner, signed off on any risks that we were bringing into the organization so that we not only can identify and address it, but also design risk mitigation strategies or acceptance and realize that, yes, we're willing to accept this risk and these are things that are going to happen if we go down this path. In today's market, we're seeing a lot of organizations that believe that you can just simply transfer risk, right? Whether that's to a third-party provider or that is to a insurance firm, or that's a software as a service or managed service or managed security provider, or anyone along those lines. The fact of the matter is, no matter the size, every organization is going to have to do something from a risk mitigation standpoint. And every organization has some level of shared responsibility. I think that hit very hard in the last few years as we saw more and more organizations migrating to Office 365 and the Azure environments, and we saw Microsoft putting in shared responsibility related to all their contract works. And so from that standpoint, we have to understand what we're providing to information to these third parties, how they're leveraging this information, and ultimately what we're going to choose to do about that. Today, we're seeing that insurance companies are asking those questions. It's becoming more and more prevalent that we are relying on third parties to do a number of activities. And I think that it becomes more of a question of what are we doing around vendor due diligence? How are we making sure that we understand what these pieces are playing in? it gets hard for us as IT professionals and security professionals to think about the fact that we've got this organization that in today's market can easily find a software as a service solution or a managed service organization that we may not be aware of. We don't know that they're wanting to connect it to our network. We don't know that they're wanting to provide this level of details because we may not have put the right structures in place from an organizational standpoint to ensure that we can get those types of evaluations done. Historically, I would create cloud security policies and managed security policies, basically outlining that we had to have this level of visibility because I wanted to encourage our business units to be able to have that entrepreneurial spirit of going off and finding new solutions, but I wanted to have the right security around it to support it and address those types of aspects too. And as we continue to see that we're moving more and more into cloud technologies or third-party solution sets, that's only going to become a harder aspect to manage and address. And so the question then becomes, how do we do it? And ultimately, it comes back to getting better understanding and reliance with your business partners so that they understand what those risks really get into. Coming from a manufacturing organization, I clearly had a large amount of people in the shop floor, especially those engineering types and those software developers, where they were trying to develop new solutions that would support the business, or they were trying to incorporate new solutions on a shop floor to make them more operationally effective. IoT devices, getting into third parties managing outdated software packages, having discussions around outdated hardware that needed to be addressed. These are all part of that risk profile that we generally have to think through because people aren't going to spend, tens of millions of dollars to go through and replace very expensive equipment on that shop floor that in essence is outdated due to a Windows device, right? They have to think about how we come back and put some other solutions in place to provide the flexibility to support those aspects. Today, we find that there is a very large amount of organizations that are sharing sensitive data and they may not be aware of it. On average, as it states on the slide, it's over 583 third parties. For both of my organizations, it was at least 250. And those were the ones that I knew about because I had to go through and get some sort of evaluation. What we need to be able to address is what does that real risk profile look like? How do we get that visibility and manageability so that we know that that third party is actually providing the right level of services? We're seeing today there's a lot of folks that are leveraging tools like Security Scorecard or BitSight or Black Kite to go through and run those reports over those organizations to get at least a visibility from an outside third party standpoint of what those organizations are really look like. Internally, we're also probably having to go through and identify which one of those organizations are critical. And if they're critical to our business, are we having the right clauses in place to ensure that we can audit those organizations, that we can have the right level of regular dialogues with those organizations, that we're discussing with our business units how they're actually going through the process of, as they add new services, making us aware so that we can also then readdress those risk factors as well. And I know this is all probably motherhood and apple pie because a lot of us have to focus on this on a daily basis. But as we've had these conversations and we recognize also that this isn't always the top priority of the executive teams, they also want to know that we've got the right checks and balances in place to support these activities. If we look at it, we also are seeing that for the majority of those third parties that are really having problems, we're still in those same base levels of ransomware and phishing attacks. That malware aspect is definitely right on target. And we're trying to figure out what are some of those best ways for us to understand how we manage that access level for those devices as well. Most of us have put the right things in place for managing the unauthorized access on-prem with multi-factor authentication, ensuring that we've got the right level of access levels because of the fact that we're doing some sort of MIA activities. When it gets to those third-party applications, it gets a little more complicated. Have we put in single sign-on? Have we put in multi-factor authentication? More importantly, are we managing the credentials in some of those environments and the configuration settings to ensure that it's going to be appropriately addressed? And 90% of all those activities that come in from breaches today are still coming through from a credential management issue in those third-party softwares aspects. We saw a huge uptick of issues specifically around Microsoft, as we went through the pandemic, and primarily because people weren't thinking about what are those security settings that need to be addressed. What do I need to be doing from an email security perspective? Can I just switch over to Microsoft? Should I be looking at other types of solution sets? What's my phishing programs look like? How do I make sure that our organizations continue with a success factor to reduce the risk overall for the organization? We're seeing a huge shift into business email compromise. And I know we're talking about third parties and we're having those discussions around root causes and specifically ransomware, but that business email compromise piece is on the rise. And we're seeing that aspect is becoming more and more prevalent and a concern. And 90% of that falls on the operational controls that need to be in place. So although our security teams are having to focus so much energy on the aspects of phishing and making sure we have security breaches being addressed, we also have to think about how we're working with our business partners to ensure there's the right types of operational controls over account transactions, ACH, master data elements. That shift is consistently changing as we look at the market space as to what we're really going to do. And the insurance aspects of those is also very different. So as we look at the insurance component, which most people still believe that we can go through and just transfer a lot of that risk factor over to cyber, the insurance companies are asking different questions. They're starting to get more engaged in the review process. For those of you that haven't had the opportunity to recently look at your renewals or haven't been through the renewal process, insurance companies are starting to add more language into those clauses to basically put responsibility in understanding third parties, but also understanding the vulnerabilities that they have inside their organization and how they're managing those risks. Traditionally, we've seen more emphasis on understanding multi-factor authentication. Now they're starting to ask about privileged access management. Hey, do you have incident response plans in place? Have we went through and addressed the areas associated with the third-party relationship management? Do we know who those critical vendors are that we're relying on? It could be something as simple as understanding your logistical company or your HVAC units and what level of access that they need to have in those organizations. We're also starting to recognize that the vulnerability management program needs to be enhanced. It's no longer going to be that you can just have an EDR solution in place to make sure that you're capturing those activities. There's questions about whether or not you have a proper program in place to actually remediate the vulnerabilities. So for example, patching. Patching is something that I think everyone has struggled with in their careers. Whether that's third-party patching or browser patching or Windows patching for that matter. I think we all believe that we're doing a decent job in that aspect of going through and trying to put those patching in place. And then we run into the situation that, hey, my vulnerability reports are still showing that I've got 20% of past patching that hasn't happened, and current patching may not be up to the full speed that needs to be, or Adobe patching is the problem, or Java patching is the problem. We're now seeing that insurance companies are putting the information in those policies, basically stating that if you are lag in your patching cycles, it could result in reductions of what they're actually going to pay out for those activities as well. This is the first year we've seen something like that. It was added earlier on. We've seen a couple of the organizations, that weren't aware of it because it's not something that's been necessarily raised, but I would be asking those questions to ensure that you've got the right type of visibility associated with it. At Fortress, we do a lot of activities with insurance companies and law firms. Over the last couple months, we've been doing sessions specifically to have these types of discussions. And what we're finding is the insurance companies that we're working on, the broker firms that we're working with, they are definitely becoming much more savvy and understanding what they need to be engaged with and the questions they need to be asking firms on how do we get the right visibility into these programs. So questionnaires that we used to get, which would be a page long, Don't be surprised that you get one for a general aspect of your corporation. And oh, by the way, your manufacturing facility, give me a little more details of what you're doing for IoT. Do you have IoT in your organization? The programs that we used to have in the past of just looking at, hey, we've got a framework in place, we've got the right types of details, I can click off my questionnaire. Those questionnaires are becoming very similar to vendor due diligence questionnaires or customer questionnaires that organizations are having to fill out to give a better understanding of how you're supporting your clients. I get that on a regular basis, and it's for all those good reasons. We need to make sure that we've got the right types of documentations in place, but more importantly, the strategies to support those types of activities as well. So as we think through this, and we're really talking about what does this really look like for risk mitigation steps, we really focus on a few things. One is, let's make sure that we have a good understanding of what all third parties that we have inside of our organization and that we're leveraging, and develop a screening process. Take the time to get an understanding of, is this vendor actually needed? What are they actually going to be providing? Limit the type of risk factors that they really are going to have by reducing their access levels into the environment, making sure they're properly managed from that standpoint, and just ensuring that you've got the right types of supportability associated with it. Two is that evaluation and selection process needs to be holistic. Get at the table. Support working with your procurement teams, your legal teams, the business units to sit down and have the right conversations around what is the solution offering really going to be providing us? What is the real impact to the business? One of my favorite questions to ask business leaders is, if this solution went down, what would it cause as an impact to your business? Are you going to reduce revenue? Is it going to cause a delay in operations? And if it is, what's that cost factor associated with it? It's getting back to those basic principles of business impact analysis so that we can have the right dialogues and help in those decision-making processes. It also helps in the selection process. If you can work with your procurement teams to ensure that you've got the right types of selection criteria of not only understanding the vendor that's coming to the table with their demographics, their supportability, in some cases, what locations they're actually in, how they're going to support the organization. And then also some of these risk factors of something as simple as, have you recently been through a breach? I think sometimes we're reluctant to ask those questions, but it's really important to put that selection criteria in, work with your procurement teams to do that on the onset, so that as you are doing the evaluation process, you are ensuring that those pieces can be properly rated from an evaluation standpoint, and then ultimately help in the selection criteria perspective. We also need to ensure that we've got strong risk assessment processes. I had developed historically 3 different views, right? I looked at a vendor that was going to be coming in for just software, so I knew that they didn't have back doors and other types of beacon issues, as well as understanding their SDLCs. I would go through and make sure that for managed service providers, I understood what kind of data elements they had, so I could tie it into our privacy ratings and work with our legal teams and data processing owners in those aspects too, so that we could have that bright light and visibility associated with it. And then I also would work with my implementation partners, partially because I wanted to make sure I knew whether or not they needed access into our environments and systems, and partially because I wanted to understand who those users were and get the resumes and just a perspective as the types of individuals that we were going to have inside the organizations as well. I think all of that gives a comprehensive view in helping make those decisions and ultimately reduce those risks associated with it, or help to start developing risk mitigation strategies. And in a lot of cases, I think that our IT security organizations believe that it's 100% on them to figure out what those risk mitigation strategies are. Ultimately, it's an effort. It's a joint effort between the business units and the IT organizations to do that. I had the opportunity to work with COOs and business leaders on bringing in new technologies, bringing in new mergers and acquisitions, new businesses into our organizations. And I had an amazing moment when I had a COO literally look at me and tell me, hey, it's okay if we don't do this. And if it really comes down and we have this risk, I'll just shut the business down. That was not something that I ever thought would happen or be an option. And having that open dialogue with these business leaders and being understanding of where they really come from and recognizing that they're looking at risk at a completely different level allowed me to start bringing the issues to the table, and then ultimately for us to make the right types of dialogues associated with it. And plans in case you did make the decision to shut a business down, or plans if you did decide to go a different way, or plans as to how to eliminate that risk long-term out of the environment as well, if that would be the case. We mentioned contracting and procurement. There's all kinds of great clauses that you need to add inside of any legal language. The procurement team is your key in making sure that you can work through those avenues. They've built great processes in place in most organizations to set up what the tone is to get a vendor into the environment or to help with vendor management. And if you can piggyback on it, it's an amazing opportunity for you. Reporting and record keeping. I think we all struggle in this, primarily because the first step is to identify. That's probably very difficult, especially when you're looking at organizations that are, in that Fortune 1000 type of scheme or above, and looking at their sprawl that they'll have over a global organization. You may not have all that visibility. It can feel very daunting at times as to how you best address that. And it really is a matter of working from a partnership perspective with other IT professionals and inside those lines of business to understand really what solution sets they have. I can guarantee you that in both organizations that I came out of, I did not know all of the software that was being used or being addressed inside of those details. I also think there's just a huge opportunity to keep some sort of CMDB or some sort of tracking to do that. I had historically done it with part of my change management structure. So as things were being done inside the IT organization, we would add a new system. I tied it in through my solution sets to help with that. And obviously that helped me with my ongoing monitoring of those solution sets and then establish those criticality associated with it. To that point, it's also really important for us to go through and make sure that we've got a proper offboarding process. Whether that's third parties that are actually coming in and doing work inside of your environment, or that's third parties that you've made the decision you just don't need them touching your systems anymore. That's always a challenge because in IT and security, we may not be as tightly integrated with the HR systems. And it's a marriage. Like you have to go through and have those regular dialogues to ensure that you've got the right types of folks at the table, making sure that they recognize the risk and it's a joint effort between those teams. So that's basically the things I look at from a risk mitigation standpoint that I've had to address. I do see a couple questions that are coming in, and I'll read them off. So Dan, thank you for asking the question about do you perform the risk assessment of a third prior to the deal, merger integration, or after? The answer is both. So when I look at mergers and acquisition activities, I try to get as much information from an open source perspective initially, which helps me get that visibility. Today, I leverage tools that provide dark web monitoring. It also provides some solution sets of that open source details. I'd recommend if you don't have access to those, work with a security practitioner or a security firm that can help you through those aspects. And it does give you some level details. The second piece is after someone has decided to do that acquisition process. Yes, I think there's a whole different level that you can do from vulnerability management, getting into those visibilities of understanding what assets they have and having those different conversations to build out that proper practice. You'll find, I think, that a lot more legal firms and security firms are partnering together today to help with those types of evaluations so that you get a good roadmap of activities that need to be done as well. And Frank, I think you're coming in to ask questions, so I apologize.
Yeah, I can definitely help out here with the Q&A so you don't have to kind of be distracted with Slack here. So appreciate you
Thank
taking
you.
that first one there. And then, another question here is in terms of risk and quantification and analysis, when technology is changing so fast and the business is changing so fast, how can we understand, comprehend those emerging technology areas within the organization? Any tips for that?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. One is, work with your IT teams to make sure that you're developing a flexible and I'll say agile infrastructure that allows for that type of technology to be properly tested, right? The days of saying, hey, I'm just not going to do something, I mean, they really are over. I can remember early on in my career, I was like, I'm never moving to the cloud. I'm never doing this. And then, hey, my first SaaS solution came on board. And then, hey, I went into infrastructure. And now we're dealing with, RPA technologies, AI, chat GPT. It really is important that you sit down and figure out how you can provide a safe space to test those things and evaluate them and work with the business partners and executive leadership to align on the right types of intro times. We're going to get pushed harder and harder on that because the technology is, to your point, changing so vastly.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple good examples of different technologies. And you said about providing those safe spaces. There's a specific question around cloud in particular, and the risk of transferring, storing, processing data in the cloud. What have you seen that has worked in terms of creating those safe spaces in the cloud?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of understanding what data elements you're doing. So I've had a couple different areas where I've had to do cloud technologies, including developing spaces for software development activities. Clearly, I'm going to establish that differently. I would absolutely make sure you're working with good partners in those spaces to help you set up those safe zones, setting up software development life cycles that have security embedded in it or areas that can be actually checked from a penetration standpoint is key. Understanding those data elements and the requirements around those data elements. I think a lot of times we go through and we start having discussions around, hey, I really want to migrate to the cloud. But I don't think about, okay, I still need to do backups of that technology, or I may not think about the fact that, hey, this type of data is more sensitive in nature, so I may need to get into a FedRAMP space. Really sitting down and understanding and dissecting that is going to help you establish the right types of control frameworks. Historically, I've always leveraged then a third party, outside vendor to help with that security design initially that had specialized in those areas. I should say now that I'm in that space, it's a different conversation, but it helped me to just understand like, hey, that checks and balances in place. I'm going to make sure that that security by design is in place up front. And then ultimately, as I'm starting that migration standpoint, I'm also testing it again. So it really is doing that monitoring aspect, that design aspect, and then that recheck component.
Great. In relation to mergers and acquisitions, a lot of times we as security leaders, we might not even get brought in until the deal is almost done or the deal is completely done. Any suggestions on kind of getting more integrated into those processes so we can try to help identify risk ideally ahead of time?
It really becomes that dialogue of how well you have a relationship at that board level or that IT steering committee level. If you don't have a steering committee inside your organization, I would recommend that you really focus some time and energy, have that discussion with the executive leadership to try to get the buy-in on it. If they understand how you can help them accelerate, in a lot of cases, the onboarding from an acquisition standpoint, or help in the evaluation process that will help them to acquire that at the right rate with including the right level of investment that would be needed, they are going to be more in tune to wanting to do that. At the end of the day, it's a financial transaction. So they're looking at to understand what is the ultimate risk factor of the organization, what are some of the things that we needed to get into. Coming into an organization that was primarily industrial manufacturing, we had a very small onset of government contract support work, but made decisions to hire or to acquire a number of businesses that were doing more of that government contract work. Initially, it wasn't as impactful, the NIST 800-171 aspects of things, right? The CMMCs. But as you continue to expand that, it becomes a different conversation. Working with my legal teams to get an understanding of what that meant from a legal perspective, a organizational structure perspective, what some risk mitigation factors came in place, it allowed me to partner with them so that they were really addressing more of the financial legal risk, which then gave me the ability to have more of that discussion on the security component to tie into it so that they understood more holistically what they were getting into.
Great. We've got a number of questions related to vendor risk management. One part of it is related to your third parties. Any tools that you've seen that have been useful in terms of questionnaires, getting insight into your third parties? And the second part of this is, well, what about those fourth parties, the vendors that your third parties actually rely on? Any suggestions on getting visibility into those areas?
Yeah, so I mean, it really comes down to how extensive you wanna look at it. I do think that those tool sets that and it's changed vastly over the last few years. If you would have asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd been like, it's not worth even buying any tools, because those tools, it all comes back to a bunch of Excel spreadsheets in most cases. For organizations that actually have enterprise-wide types of programs, if you have a GRC tool in place, they're great to start with. For organizations that don't, I wouldn't spend the time trying to figure it out, because more than likely you're not going to get the buy-in and they're expensive. There are solutions on the market space that you can work with. You can also work with some MSSPs as well that may be providing services around third-party management. The benefit that they bring to you is they more than likely are using a tool set that allows them to see the third party, but to your point, the party of that third party as well. And at least it's going to give you some visibility to understand the sprawl of the potential data that could be going. It also is going to give you some visibility as to how risky that particular platform is. And in most cases, they'll give them, a scorecard so that you can focus in on some of those areas. And they may even give you some visibility into some dark web aspects or credential leaks and those components. So I think that's helpful to be a starting point. The second one is, I think you really have to build out a structure that focuses on the prioritization of doing those reviews. You obviously cannot review 1,000 vendors in a year. That's just not going to happen. The tools and the amount of people is exhaustive. But I do think that what you can do is say, hey, there's these 10 vendors that are really material, or 20 vendors that are really material as my business. So I'm going to establish that I need to meet with them quarterly or annually or semi-annually from that standpoint. And then the other ones you start cycling through in the right types of space as well. If you are leveraging MSPs, SPs, or you're leveraging tools like the security scorecard, BitSight, Black Kite for that matter, if you're using those ones, the nice thing is they give you alerts. So it gives you a different type of approach. If you say you have 20 vendors that you're using software as a service specifically, or IaaS, it then allows you to see, hey, I just saw something hit from a credential perspective, and I can go dive in and have that conversation with the vendor as well.
Great. Well, Jess, hey, there are a few more questions here, but we're kind of out of time, and so we really appreciate you, sharing all your insights about risk and managing risk. And yeah, it definitely is a little bit of a conundrum when we try to solve it on a day-to-day basis. So thanks so much for sharing your experience, everybody. Virtual round of applause for Jess. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.